Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, this is Zoe Routh. Welcome to the show. I am a leadership expert. I am an intrepid explorer of the leadership landscape. I call myself a team navigator. I love to work with teams and team leaders to move from frustrated and stuck in endless conversations going nowhere to high energy, fast flowing, high performers. And today's show is all about that high performance piece. My guest, his name is Gerald Leonard, and he's got an interesting background. He is a conservatory-trained professional bassist, so a musician by background, and quickly moved into linking some of the musical principles into high performance and culture. And he's linked it all together with neuroscience as he keeps studying and leaning into discovering what makes great teams, what produces great results. So we have a fantastic conversation about all of this. He is also the author of 2 books. His latest one is called Workplace Jazz, 9 Steps to Creating High-Performing Agile Project Teams. And the principles apply to any particular type of team, and they stand the test of time. They stand the rigor of research as well. So we have a lovely conversation about performance, about teams, about how to survive in the hybrid work environment and how the principles apply across all of that. So, without further ado, let's do this thing. Well, welcome to the show, Gerald Leonard, all the way from Daphne, Alabama. We've never had anybody from Alabama on the show before, so I'm really happy to have you here.
Well, Zoe, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, and you have such an interesting background. So you're a musician by background, a conservatory-trained professional bassist, and now you're working in the consulting area around productivity and culture. So first of all, how did you get into music, and how did that leapfrog you into working with organizations around productivity and culture?
Okay, great questions. I started actually playing the guitar or piano when I was around 10 years old. And it turned out to be a little story where my sister actually owned the guitar, and she never would play it, so I would sneak into her room and grab it and play it. And one day she found me, so she let me have it. You know, sisters would, in both ways. She let me have the guitar, but she also let me have it for taking her guitar. And I just fell in love with music at that time. Did it in high school, studied, purchased my own instrument, went to college for it, did my undergrad in Central State University in Ohio, and did a bachelor's in music with classical and jazz. And then went down to Cincinnati Conservatory, where I did my master's in classical studies and played professionally for most of my life. And then around the time I moved to New York after I graduated grad school. And I did some ministry work for about 5, 6, 7 years, playing and doing ministry work. And after having a family and having little kids and being on the road a little bit, I decided that's not what I wanted to do, was to be on the road. And so at the time, if you could spell IT, you could get into it. And so I had a little bit of computer training, and I'm an avid reader, so I love reading books. And so I just read everything I could get my hands on about computers and realized it was like picking up another instrument, because the logic behind playing an instrument, theory, working on the computer, theory, coding, looking at notes and code, it all kind of made sense to me. It just kind of like worked. And I did that and realized I didn't want to go back and get another master's in finance or accounting or IT. So I did the certification route, and I just took every certification I could, from Microsoft to Novell to project management. And I turned around and I had a ton of certifications and had been working in the field for a couple of years, and ended up at a consulting firm where they really taught me how to be a consultant. And that's where I started and cut my teeth in. And then realized that my passion was organizing chaos, because that's what I did as a musician. I would be the one who would organize the band and kind of coordinate things. And when I looked at what I naturally fell into, it was around productivity. So I did put in the time and did the Microsoft project management, project server tools. Then I did the PMP certification from PMI, Project Management Institute. Then lately I did one that was a couple of years ago, 2016. I did one called the PFMP, which is the portfolio, which you have to have 10 years of experience in your C-suite type of conversation. And through consulting, I realized that it was a lot like playing jazz and a lot like working in a band. When I first started playing or consulting, the consulting groups were large, sometimes 20 people. But over time, because of economics and advancements in technology, it became groups of 5 people. It became groups of 3 or 4 people. And it was like a trio or a quartet. And you'd walk in, you meet with the client, and you develop this vibe. And when things felt like we were playing jazz and that the sponsor was engaged, I knew we were going to have a great project. When I felt like we were fighting and trying to figure out who's on first, I knew that was not going to go well, and it wasn't going to deliver what the client wanted because, again, it didn't flow. And so I realized that there was this connection between that. And then also where the culture comes in is when you're doing project management, portfolio management, any kind of productivity work, you're constantly changing the environment, whether it's physical, virtual, documentation, or whatever. And by doing that, you're changing the order in which things get done, and you're changing part of the culture. Because part of culture is who's doing what, how are we going to do it, who has authority to do what. And when you're implementing systems, you're actually making major changes in that. And I realized that successful projects spend more time thinking about the culture and adopting the solution to the culture, making it adaptable and adoptable by the audience, if you will, than just focusing on the technology. And so that really drove me to kind of combine really 4 things, which is, using my music as a background on metaphor to explain some of the concepts, productivity, workplace culture, and then neuroscience. And so I really got into neuroscience, did a certification in it, and really realized how much conversational intelligence, emotional intelligence plays into culture and also sustaining productivity within organizations. So,
wow, that's that's an amazing journey of obsession with learning and development, and I love it. There's a couple of things I want to dig into. One of them, I think, is, which I think you just said it casually, but I think is actually quite remarkable, is the fact that music is similar to science and maths. My husband is also a pianist, and he's saying that all the time, that music is just like maths. And me, who is not a music person at all, is like, how is that? Is that even possible? So my understanding, it's like it's a type of language. Music is a type of language. Maths and IT is a type of language. And that's how you make parallels. Am I onto the right track there?
Well, that's a part of it. But the other part is music is very symmetrical. It's very measured. So, whether you're playing in a small group or you're playing in this orchestra ensemble with a complicated, Bach, Stravinsky, or any of those things like that, pieces that you may play, it's all mathematically calculated, as well as sound. Sound deals with math. Tone deals with math. All of those things deals with different parts of math, and it's high-level math. What's interesting, though, is that when you're learning music and you're learning to play because you're enjoying it and having fun, you're not thinking about math. But what you're doing is you're developing the same neurological pathways that your brain would use for math. It's being developed, being used for music. And so when I was in college and I had to take electives in mathematics, and I took an algebra class and something else, and the math teacher came to me and goes, "Why are you a music major?" I said, "Because that's what I love to do. That's my passion." She goes, "But you do so well in math." I was like, at the time I hadn't put the two together, but I was like, okay, but that still is not, just because I'm good at it doesn't mean that's what I want to do in my life. But she noticed that I was really good at math from that angle, even high level math. And I didn't understand it always, but it was not until afterwards of being professional and playing for a while that I really began to understand. And I think it was really when I got into computers, how just learning the mathematics and the logic behind how the computer works, how it handles code, how to interpret code, how you think visually, but then you're writing these. There's a structure, and the same thing when you're playing music or you're writing music. There's a structure to it, and it's coded, right? Because if you don't know the notes, you don't know how to read it. That makes no sense to you. But somebody who does, like your husband, who's a pianist, he sits down and sees, a piano staff, and he goes to work and just starts playing all this stuff, and this music comes out. And it's the same way developers write code, and then the computer creates all these beautiful programs or productivity tips or things that it can do. So it's really interesting how they're all connected.
It is interesting. So I'm projecting now that this whole idea of structure and patterns then applied to your insights around systems and the manufacturing or the impact of changes in systems on culture. So let's talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind. What kind of systems create good culture and what kind of systems create poor culture?
Well, I think it's more than the systems. It's really the structure of the organization. And I wrote a book. My first book was called Culture is the Base. And it's all about culture. In fact, I wrote it at a time where the song All About That Bass was out. And it really takes the idea that just like bass lines are super important for great music, well, culture is super important for great companies or great projects. And there were 7 things that kept standing out to me when I first did the research. And I read a number of articles and case studies at Harvard Business Review and Wharton and MIT. And the 7 things were that you had to have a great vision. You had to have values that were inconsistent, but then everyone had to buy in. And there had to be great stories. They had to have a great environment as well as best practices. And then around those 6 things, you execute it. So there had to be a process for execution. And what I found was that every culture has one of those 7 things involved. And if a culture is not going well, it's one of those 7 things that's out of line. It's either the vision for where the company is going isn't clear and communicated, or it's clear, but people haven't bought into it. Or the value system that the organization, which is values just the behaviors of the organization, aren't structured to support the vision. And people aren't buying into it. And people buy into things through stories, through the story of why did you start? Why did you get there? How did this happen? Why are we going this direction? And so what I found was that with those 7 items, it's really important. So irregardless of the system or technology that you're implementing, it's really the process of culture. And that framework allowed me to kind of create a mental model that's easy to hang your hat on. Because I know if I have these 7 things in place, then I know that I can have a great culture.
So Gerald, let me just double check. I've only got 6 here. So maybe there's one missing for me. Vision, values, buy-in, stories, environment, execution.
Best practices.
Oh, best practices.
Environment and execution.
Great. Thank you so much. One of the things that you reflect on is working in hybrid teams. So with the advent of COVID and people splitting off and working from home and having this combination of work from home come into the office situation, how has this impacted people's ability to perform as a culture? These 7 elements got jumbled around a little bit in the hybrid environment. So what's your take on how people can survive that and get better at doing hybrid culture?
Well, in a lot of ways, it really doesn't change those 7 elements. Because if you think about the hybrid culture in a virtual environment, do we need to have a great vision? Whether we're meeting face-to-face or virtually? Yes. Do we need to have a set of values that we all agree to, that we're going to live by? How we're going to run meetings, how we're going to interact with each other, how we're going to interface, how we're going to treat each other, and so on? Yes. Do we need to get everybody to buy in? Well, yes. Now, to get buy-in, it may require having some one-on-one virtual meetings. Instead of just constantly getting everybody together in groups, it's having some virtual coffees, if you will, since we can't get together. But having these, just like if you were to, have a one-on-one in your office and you're sitting across from each other, you can do that virtually. And the interesting part about it is when you turn the camera on, you see someone's face, you see their surrounding, you see their environment, you pick up on the nonverbal cues, just as if you were across the room. Not obviously, there are certain things you can't see, but obviously there's a lot that you can see. It's facial expressions. So you pick up on all those. So, to long story short, all of those 7 elements can be adopted to a virtual hybrid co-located where you're working face-to-face as well as virtual environment. As long as you have those in place and you're paying attention to them, you can create a culture that operates really, really well in a virtual environment. And a lot of the great companies that have survived, not only survived, but have thrived during the pandemic, adopted that mindset that you can do both. But it also requires, I would say, an 8th element, and that's trust.
Oh, let's talk about that. So what do you mean by that in a virtual environment?
Well, obviously in a physical environment, trust is I trust you as far as I can see you.
Yeah.
And so if I see you in the office, or I see you managing my project, or I see you coming to work, or I see you punching the clock, I trust you. But now you're in an environment where you're not going to be on camera 8 hours a day watching your people work.
God, can you imagine?
That would be totally impractical. So, and obviously people have meetings and so on. So businesses were forced to have to trust their employees. They were forced to. And what they realized was, wait a minute, because they don't have to, some of these folks don't have to commute, and they don't have all of these, they're spending so much time at the water cooler or having these side conversations, they're actually getting more work done. And they found that majority of employees were very productive because they were able to kind of schedule their meetings, and they had to work out the whole idea of Zoom fatigue and Zoom meetings, back to back and so on and so forth. But they found that the majority of the employees were much more productive. And they also realized that the work-life balance really became just the norm, right? I mean, you jump on a call and, the person you're meeting with is a new mother and she wasn't able to get a babysitter or she doesn't want a babysitter coming over because of the COVID. And so now she's kind of having to juggle the toddler as well as being on a meeting. And because you've been a parent before, you go, no problem. Don't worry about it. Just mute while we're talking or whatever, and then jump in when we can. And you realize that everybody's human. And so it really forced us to be more human with each other and be more, instead of the phony, I have to be corporate and dress a certain way and do a certain thing to be productive and be effective. You have a family, you have a life, you have this environment that you have to, and we're all in it together. We were all forced in that environment. So I think it made everyone a little bit more sensitive to being human with each other and realizing that we can trust other people and other workers to do their job and to live up to the standard. And obviously you're going to have some folks who are not going to do that and they have to deal with it that way. But for the majority, I think people learn that you can trust others.
I think it's true to a certain extent in terms of it depends on the individual company. And I think the ones that were struggling were where they didn't have best practices or really good execution discipline. And they really relied on eyeballing people's performance to ensure that things were delivered. And those are the ones that really struggled with this hybrid arrangement. So, and I think it was also the attitude of some of the leaders who preferred to have control. And by control means if I can see them, then I know what's going on. And that's kind of their own personal preference around that. I would like to, Gerald, if we could dive into a little bit around some of your principles in workplace jazz, which, oh my God, Jack Canfield recommended your book and gave you a whole interview. I'm like, amazing. I'll talk to you after the recording about how you actually pulled that one off. That's well done. So what are the core principles or concepts in workplace jazz?
Well, in workplace jazz, there are 9 principles. And I know it's a lot more than 7 or 5. There are 9. And it starts off with improvement, really just focusing on individual improvement. And then it goes into measuring what matters, positivity, having a positive attitude, risk, managing risk, being open to feedback, visualization, just really visualizing your goals or where you want your team to go, being aspirational, as well as being surrendered to support, and then excellence in execution. So those are the 9 areas. And I chose those 9 areas because, one, it spelled the word improvise as far as jazz.
Right.
So it made a great acronym. And then 2, when I thought about, what sets musicians apart when you come together as a musician, and let's say you've never played together and you're doing a show. Well, first you individually have had to continually keep working on your craft, right? You continually keep working on your craft. So you're constantly improving, you're constantly practicing, and you're doing deliberate practicing. You're also measuring that you're improving. You're measuring that, okay, last week I couldn't play this piece, now I can play this piece. And you measure yourself as a group. Before we first started, we were sight reading this piece, and now we can play it, and you can see the performance. You can see how it goes.
Gerald, can I just ask about that measuring what matters in the workplace context? So a great example from the musical world. What are some great examples in the work world about measuring what matters? What do people need to be aware of when they're thinking about that aspect?
I think that people need to be aware of measuring it's kind of like the balanced scorecard measurement, where you look at the internal process and customers and finances and so on, and you're focused on a few vital measures. For instance, I just went, we had spring break. My wife and I went out to the Big Island of Hawaii for a vacation. And, as we were flying over, especially when we were flying back, we could watch it was like a night flight. So you can watch the trajectory of the plane kind of going towards LA to Dallas. That's where we ended up landing. And the interesting part about it is that it hit me. The earth is turning at 1,000 miles an hour. The plane is flying at 500 miles an hour towards a target that's constantly moving.
Yeah. Yep.
So what do you measure? Well, you have to measure that. Am I staying on track with all of everything that's moving? If there's like one measurement, are we on target? Are we constantly adjusting? And because we are measuring that one thing that's really important, we're constantly having to adjust the airplane, or they had to constantly adjust the airplane so that we landed in Dallas, 6-7 hours later. And, for businesses, they have to identify the 1, 2, or 3 things that they constantly have to measure that then they constantly will adjust to basically allow them to perform. When you have an organization that has too many measurements, it's like paralysis of analysis. It's how you tame a lion. Why do they use a 4-legged stool with a lion? Because it's too many things to focus on. So the lion kind of gets confused, and even though he's ferocious, he backs away and becomes docile. If it was one thing to focus on, yes, that's why they use a stool. Because
I had no idea.
Distracting. It's distracting for the lion. And so but if the lion had one thing to focus on, it knows what to do. And so I think with businesses, all of the great businesses that are out there, whether you look at Google or Microsoft or Nordstrom or any of the companies that you admire that are like really, Amazon, that are really great companies, when you look at their key metrics, they only have a few that they measure. They look at them and they measure them based on a results-oriented and predictable measurement, but something that they can act on, that can be acted upon.
Do you have any specific examples, like of like, if they only have a few, what would be the types of things that they're looking at? Do you know?
I would say so I have and I'll have to speak from a productivity standpoint. I have a client with Virginia Department of Transportation. They have over probably now around 7,000 or 8,000 projects that they're managing. They have about a $25 billion budget.
Wow.
And of road construction projects across just the one state. And, I helped them develop a scheduling solution with 3 developers that would really allow them to streamline that process. But now, because they have all the data in one place, they can measure if something is on time and on budget. And so what we do is we focus on, the on time or on schedule measurement, and we have thresholds or parameters around that. Well, when you have 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 projects in a schedule, there's no way you can measure everything. So you set up some verifications and validations, and then you set up thresholds, and anything that falls outside of the thresholds, what you go act on. You go meet with those project managers. So that way you get a count of everything that's going on, and you know that everything that's going on is being measured, and there's a lot of automation set up so that it gets rid of the human error of, are we measuring things correctly? So we have that automated so that we know we're measuring things correctly and predictably. But when it comes to what do we act on the outliers. Can we catch the schedule that's going off track early enough and help bring it back on? Or is that one that's just going to be an outlier? So, when it comes to productivity, things along that line, and I'm sure from a Google or a Microsoft or Amazon standpoint, they have a number of other measurements from a strategy standpoint that they measure that makes a big difference for them.
I like that. So having a way of understanding what are the patterns in the workplace. And so that sort of alarm bell system is one way of keeping the plane on track, if you're going back to
exactly
that analogy. Yeah. And I think that's pretty important for complex project management. That's for sure. So I interrupted you on measuring what matters as part of your 9 principles of improvise. Positivity, risk, feedback, and visualizing. Can we talk a little bit about visualizing? You mentioned as one of the key principles. What do you mean by that?
So anytime musicians get together and they're performing, they have a visual outcome for what they're looking to do in their performance. They know, one, we want to engage the audience. They know if people have been working hard all week and they're coming to them for some form of entertainment, but also be taken on a journey. And so they visualize what that performance is going to look like. Individual musicians, I know for myself, you visualize a performance. You visualize how you want to perform. You visualize how are you going to play that piece and what do you want it to sound like, so that when you're in the moment, you've already kind of lived that experience. And so your body, your mindset kind of act on what you've already visualized. I found that great teams visualize by having a great charter. In other words, they have a great plan for what the project is going to do. Right now, a lot of companies are doing agile work, and they use something called user stories and acceptance criteria. And the user story is basically kind of like a requirement, but it's how would the user use this solution once it's created, right? And then how will we validate that through the acceptance criteria? That's a form of visualization by writing that out, getting everyone on the team to go, hey, this is the user story, and here's how we're going to validate it. So we can kind of now visually see through words what the outcome of that's going to look like. And once we do that, we know how we're going to test it, how we're going to code it, who's going to validate that it's working correctly. And the user knows that when they get the solution, this is what it should do. So they have a visual, even with words, they have a visual of what should be when the solution or product or process is completed. By doing that, it really allows you to activate the brain for different possibilities of, okay, how can we make this better? Or how do we fulfill this? Because sometimes when you come up with the larger story or the big picture, you don't really have a clear picture of all of the how-tos to make that work. But by visualizing it, your brain goes to work on it and the team brain goes to work on it. And then you come up with these great ideas as you're working as a team through the process, and you're holding each other accountable. So visualization to me is extremely important. It's like any major sports team. They all visualize. The ones that make it to the Super Bowl, obviously a lot of them are trying to visualize that, but they have that culture in place where everyone is on the same page. They all work as hard as the other person. They all kind of pull each other together. They all bought in, and visualization is a big part of that.
I love that. So you touch on the other really important piece is buy-in. So you mentioned earlier that stories are a way of getting people to buy in. Are there other ways, Gerald, of getting people to buy into the end result, to the vision, to the process, to the whole thing, really?
Well, I think the first 3 things I talked about are a couple of things I talked about, which is the vision and values. If someone is going to join your team and you explain what the vision of the team is and what the values are, and those are not their values, and that's not the way they want to operate, then you know that person's not going to buy in, right? And even in our country right now, we have political parties. There's a vision for America or a vision for our country, but there may be different sets of values that people are willing to live by, which creates a conflict. And so just like with a team, if you have a clear vision of where the team is going and a clear set of values that are documented or laid out, that this is what we stand for, this is how the team's going to operate, then we want to now hire people. We want to bring people on the team who have that mindset of they're going to buy into the vision, but they're going to also be willing to live by the values. So once you have that, then you add stories of why did we start this? Where did this come from? What's the origin story, and so on and so forth. Or maybe there are stories about as you're going along, things happen and you overcame something as a team. Well, then you go back and you keep telling that story. So when other things come up, a good example of that is on one of my projects. In fact, the project where I was working with the Department of Transportation. When we initially came on board, my team, they had 14,000 projects in their program. And they were trying to weed through all of this data. And the first day that we met, it was a large meeting. The CIO was there. All the business folks were there. The developers were there that hadn't met. It was like two developers that hadn't met. They were for the first time there. The one other developer was with me. We had lunch together. So we're a relatively very new team. And the CIO looks at me and goes, okay, well, you're the team lead, and you're the subject matter expert on this. The commissioner, we had been told that this was going to be ready in about 15 days.
Wow.
And we're just having the first meeting, and he knew that was not going to be impossible to have something in production in 15 days, but he wanted to have something as a proof of concept. So I looked at him and I said, well, does it have to be in production? He goes, no. Does it be in test? No. And it says, can it be set up in development? Yes. Does it have to be 100 projects or can it be one? If you can get one project to go from the old system to this new system and they communicate and work together and I can prove that and show that, great. Do we have to have all the documentation around that? No. I just want to see that it works. Okay. So we literally sat there and just kind of negotiated. And we started meeting as a team daily, hourly to kind of pull this together and literally installing things and building stuff out and so on and so forth. And on day 14, I had the youngest member of our team, who was a developer, do the demo because the CIO knew him personally. So he knew that this was all new for him as well. And so I kind of talked them through it. And he literally walked them through the demo of the old system, communicating with the new system, and everything working. And it worked as what we explained it would work. And he was like, thumbs up, you guys are green lighted to continue with this project. I'll let the commissioner know that we're good to go. And that gives us time and so on and so forth. And it's been now 7 years later, 8 years later that we're all still together pretty much. But it started with a proof of concept, and it started with negotiating. It started with having that conversation and just kind of showing that, and that became a story for the team. In fact, there's a story in my book. I call it 15 Days Till Liftoff, of how do you deal with unrealistic expectations and whittle them down to where you can deliver something that is within reason and still meet the need of an executive. But that story got us through so many other challenges that we faced on the project, because we would go back and remember 15 Days Till Liftoff. We didn't think we were going to do that. We didn't know how to do that. But we jumped in feet first, got started, communicated, worked together as a team, and we threw a Hail Mary and we pulled it out, and it worked.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things that you also mentioned is how to have fun together. So for me, it sounds like, of course, people need to have fun. And that yet I've been at least 2 different team situations where participants in the room said, I don't think we need to have fun. And I always find that shocking to have that people have that perspective, is that the work doesn't necessarily need to have fun in it. What's your sense of that?
I think celebrating and having fun is a core part of a team, our family. And it's really important. And even in a virtual environment, and here's one of the things I learned about something called conversational intelligence, which is the neuroscience of conversations. When you meet someone for the first time, within 0.07 seconds, just from voice inflection or intention, tonality of the voice, mentally you already know, am I going to enjoy this conversation or not?
Mm-hmm.
You already know it.
Yep.
And you may not know exactly how you know it, but mentally, you know it because our brains are at a much higher level communicating. Even you're in Australia and I'm here in the US, and our brains initially, when we first started working to kind of get the whole video set up and our podcast set up, knew that, okay, let's make this work. Let's figure this out. And there was a positivity about it. And, we're here. And that's true with virtual teams and teams in general. So when someone says, we're not going to have fun, what they're saying is that they want to invite in everyone to experience tons of adrenaline and tons of cortisol, because those are the neurochemicals that our brain starts producing when you're not having fun. Because now you're in a life-threatening situation and you're thinking, okay, when is this going to be over? Okay, come on. And now you're getting tense and you need a massage and your neck is stiff and, okay, and you're doing all of that. Where if it's fun, it's engaging, you're enjoying the conversation, people are smiling, your brain, even if it's in Australia and other ones in the United States, is producing dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Those are all the feel-good chemicals. And you walk away going, man, I really enjoyed that conversation. Well, that emotional experience is basically neurochemicals.
Yeah, that's great. So it sort of helps me put in context those two incidents where people say, I don't want to have fun. It means like they're so used to running on the cortisol and adrenaline in their interactions with others. And so they're more used to the drama than they are to the celebration stuff.
Exactly. And our brains can get addicted to our own neurochemicals. So if you wonder why someone who's, constantly finds themselves in a negative situation and they kind of feed on that, it's because their brains become addicted to cortisol and adrenaline. And it goes, well, I know if something's negative and intense and distrusting, the brain's going to produce that. So let's create more of that.
Yeah. Can you change that addiction?
You can. I mean, you can over time, but you can also, as a team leader, do exercises or activities to increase the flow of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, whether it's just virtual coffees or virtual games or virtual conversations, or asking people, what's their favorite vacation on a work call as an icebreaker. You get people out of themselves. I had a team once that doing one of my projects where we had a bunch of new people come in, and the flow and the exchange wasn't the greatest from some of the managers that gave us these team members, because they weren't aware of all the complexity we had put into the system. And so I knew that for them to get it, it wasn't going to be a matter of just explaining the complexity. It was going to be a matter of us all being on the same page and seeing ourselves as one. So I did an exercise called Rules of Engagement that I got from the Conversational Intelligence book and certification I went through, and was basically everyone in the room got a stack of sticky notes, and they wrote down, I asked them the question, what are some of the attributes of your favorite teams or groups that you've been a part of where you had the most fun? And so they wrote down, trustworthy, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And then I had them go and put it on the wall on like sticky notes and create what they call an infinity diagram. So if two people had the same words, they had to put them on top of each other. And what we noticed is that over time, we had way more in common than we had about what we wanted from a team than what were outliers. And so by seeing those core values that we then said, okay, these are going to be our principles for our team, it opened everyone up to go, wow, this is really cool. I didn't know these people, and now I have more in common with them than I thought I did. And it really brought the team together, and it took a situation that could have been really complex and a drain to try to explain a lot of the complex process that we put in place. And, it's kind of challenging their knowledge of coding and so on. But by getting everybody on the same page as far as our values, it allowed people to drop their egos and go, okay, now I'm in a support role and I'm in a learning mode.
Yeah, and that helps build that sense of vulnerability and intimacy, which is boosts the oxytocin and serotonin.
Exactly. And in fact, one of the core principles in the book is surrender to support. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is, as a bass player, I mean, the majority of your life as a musician is supporting other people.
Yeah.
I mean, everything you're the bass player. You're playing the solid bass line over and over again, if it's a pop song or whatever, and that's your job, mm-hmm. is to lay down that rhythm with the drummer, and you're just there. And I have an example of a gentleman named David Dyson. He's one of the best bass players I've ever heard, and he's one of the hardest working bass players I've ever seen, contemporary. And he is the music director for Pieces of a Dream, a number of jazz ensembles, jazz groups that have won Grammys and so on. He's Grammy nominated twice, but his group has been put into the Jazz Hall of Fame or R&B Hall of Fame, one of those. But anyway, on the concert night that they were getting inducted to the Hall of Fame, they played one of his songs that he wrote. Well, as the bass player, he's playing his piece. And everyone around him is playing the melody. All the other instruments are soloing. He's just simply sitting in the back as the director, playing the bass, playing the lines. Yeah, through the whole time, he didn't take a solo. He didn't do anything to stand out as I'm the guy. It was simply, he wrote the song, he's the music director, he's the bass player, everybody else got to shine. But by doing that, he actually got to shine even more, because it was obvious who the leader was, even though he wasn't standing out to be the leader. And I used him as an example of that chapter of being surrendered to support. And because of that, I would say all of the, Peter White, Jonathan Butler, Gerald Albright, all of these amazing jazz musicians call this guy to play.
That's amazing. That's a great story.
He's going to lay down the rhythm, and he's going to play his part, and he's just going to make it happen. And they're not going to have to worry about, where's David?
I love it. Lay down the rhythm. That's a nice leadership principle, isn't it? Just lay down the rhythm. Let others shine.
Exactly.
Gerald, that's fantastic. I've got one last question for you. And you said you're an avid reader, and I'm always looking for book recommendations. What's your latest favorite book that you're reading?
My latest favorite book that I'm reading, there are a number of them. I would say one that I read that has been transformative, and I'll use the one that I did my certification in, and it's called Conversational Intelligence. And after reading the book, I looked up the Judith Glaser who wrote the book, and unfortunately, about 3 years now, she passed away from pancreatic cancer. But before she did, I got to participate in a certification program with her for 2 years that she put together with her husband on the neuroscience of conversations. And it really is the foundation of culture, because all culture is based on conversations and relationships, and all relationships are based on conversations. And again, it is the neuroscience of those conversations and how we interact with each other, and how our brains get in the way, or get in the way in a positive or negative way in conversations. And it's more than a verbal exchange. There's a chemical exchange that happens that most of us are unaware of when we have conversations.
Love it. So I'll definitely go, and I think I have that book. It's time for review. It's been a while since I actually picked it up, and dive into it again. Gerald, this has been fabulous. Thank you. I've got a cocktail of feel good serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine happening right now.
Excellent. That's the goal.
That's right. That's the goal. It worked. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been grand.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks so much, Zoe, for having me.
I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation with Gerald. We got off the recording and we had a couple minutes together, and I was saying, sometimes these interviews can be a blessing and a curse in that you just want to spend more time with the amazing people that you get to meet. And Gerald is certainly one of those. I think he's doing amazing work, amazing insights with teams of all sorts of different complexities. Probably for me, a couple of key takeaways is the use of visualizing, to create user stories, to think about the end in mind, to create buy-in for people. So visualizing kind of hooks the reason for why we're doing it, and buy-in is reinforcing it through the stories that we produce of epic accomplishments like the ones that Gerald shared. I love his quote, "Culture is created in conversation." And as I was thinking about that, I was like, culture is created in conversation, leadership is conversation, and results are delivered by teams. And I think the ability to lead a team and to be part of a team is really at the essence of what we need in order to deliver high performance. So if you enjoyed the show, please share it with somebody else. Give them the gift of saying, hey, listen to the show, got some great insights, great conversation. Feel free to rate and review the podcast, which is actually not that easy to do. I'm trying to do it on your laptop. I was struggling to find how you could actually do that in iTunes, so that's a bit annoying. So if you do actually manage to work it out, maybe on your mobile device, that would be fantastic. It is very, very much appreciated. As always, this show is brought to you by our premium advanced leadership training program, Amplifiers. It's designed for CEOs, managing directors, and senior executives who want a cohort of peers from various backgrounds to act as sounding board and support. Because let's face it, it's lonely at the top. So in this program, not only do you develop your own leadership skills and perspective, you get to do it alongside a bunch of other amazing people. So wherever you are on the planet, you can dial into our virtual platform and virtual training sessions. And if you happen to be in Canberra, where I'm based, you can come along to our live face-to-face immersions. Eventually, we will have more immersions around the country where you can drop into. In the meantime, you know what to do. Live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.